Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents No Turning Back by T.L. Payne, narrated by Shawn Compton. Prologue. It was windy. It was noisy. And analyst Rachel Stevens could smell the fuel as the vintage, propeller-driven, two-seater T-6 Texan airplane climbed to 20,000 feet and headed toward Killeen, Texas. The pilot, 75-year-old Ernest Elliott of Crosby, Texas, had over 7,000 hours of experience flying the thing, or so he kept saying every time she asked if it were safe. She'd thought she hated flying in a 747, but this was like being strapped to the outside of the space shuttle and launched into space. If the nation's fate had not been at stake, she would have walked to Fort Hood before getting in the ancient machine. Stevens wanted to kiss the ground when they landed safely at Fort Hood. Armed escorts met her, and she was whisked away to meet with the base commander, Major General Brian Waltrip. The Central Texas Army base was a buzz of activity, with joint light tactical vehicle trucks lined up heading somewhere. From what Stevens had learned, the Grey Wolf Brigade and 1st Cavalry Division had been undergoing huge modernization efforts in recent years. They looked to be mobilizing, ready to take the fight to the enemy. It was an encouraging sign after what she'd witnessed firsthand down in Houston. They escorted Stevens through a maze of hallways to a secure room at the end of a long corridor. The sensitive compartmented information facility looked much like the one at Ellington. She waited in the skiff for at least an hour before the base commander appeared. He asked for his aide to wait outside.
"I'm sorry to keep you waiting, Analyst Stevens. As you can imagine, we've been quite busy."
Waltrip took a seat across from her, leaned forward, and interlaced his fingers.
"Tell me what you've got there."
Stevens gave him a brief background on the investigation her team had been conducting into Chinese illegally crossing the border with the Mexican drug cartel's aid. Only a minute into her briefing, Waltrip began tapping his index finger on the table. He was getting impatient, so she skipped the rest and opened the laptop. She typed in her login and password, pulled up the encrypted file, typed the password, and turned the computer around to face him. He leaned in and studied the screen. His eyes met hers.
"What am I looking at?"
"Names, dates, locations."
"How did you get this?"
"A Chinese double agent. It's legit. We've confirmed it. The commander at Ellington sent troopers to 12 of the locations indicated here, and all had already been targeted. Pipelines, roads, refineries." Waltrip held up one hand. He stood and walked to the door, opened it, and spoke to the soldier on the other side.
"Your counterparts will be here in 5 minutes. I need to inform Southcom we finally have something actionable."
"You're in contact with Southern Command?" He hesitated.
"Through the 4th Fleet," he said as he exited the skiff and shut the door behind him.
Minutes later, the door opened. Stevens stood.
"I heard you were down in Honduras,"
Brad Smith said as he closed the door and approached her. It shocked Stevens to see Smith in Texas, as the last she knew, he'd been in London. He held his arms open as if to give her a hug. She took a step back and held out her hand. She'd called off their relationship, and they hadn't spoken for over 9 months. He was going to act like nothing had happened. She wasn't. "I was, for a while. I've been in Houston for the last 3 months following the money."
"Waltrip's aide said you've got something there," he said, pointing to the computer.
This was it. He was going to move right in and take over. He'd take the credit, of course. "At first I thought it was a decoy, something to throw us off, but it checked out. They've already hit several of the targets on this list. Ellington was hit, overrun with insurgents." Smith reached up and lightly touched her forehead.
"Was that where you got that?"
Stevens ran a finger across her forehead just above the brow. It was sticky. "I had a building blow up around me." He smiled.
"I'm glad you made it out."
She sensed she was giving into his charms, but pulled back. She wouldn't let him get to her, not again. She reminded herself why she'd called it off. "How's Victoria?" she asked. His smile faded.
"Fine, as far as I know. She's in London."
She pitied him, momentarily. She would be a wreck if she had a significant other and a newborn child that far away at a time like this. "Show me," Smith said. pointing to the laptop. "Let's see if we can put a stop to their little plan." They spent an hour going over every piece of information contained on the flash drive that Kim Yang had stolen from her Chinese handler. It was like old times. They bounced ideas off one another and even laughed occasionally. Soon they were joined by Chinese interpreters and several other analysts in the tiny skiff. Stevens grew increasingly claustrophobic. As they discussed what they'd learned, her face flushed and her pulse rate increased. She was feeling lightheaded and wondered when was the last time she ate. It had been a crazy day. There hadn't been time to take care of her body. "We cut off communications between General Dempsey and Colonel Edwards. Ellington has Edwards in custody. Now Dempsey has no way of coordinating with the Chinese through him," Stevens said. "We need to make sure that he cannot contact anyone else from the People's Liberation Army," Smith said. "What if the PLA's Navy has already landed their expeditionary force somewhere along the Gulf Coast?" Stevens asked. "We've already intercepted several amphibious assault ships. They'll utilize hovercraft and helicopters to land troops. They'll use something similar to our San Antonio class to do it from much further offshore than traditional landing craft," a man in a naval uniform said. She'd forgotten his name already and looked for a name tape. "Schaefer." She raised an eyebrow when she noticed the green beret on the table next to his right hand. "But we have ships in the Gulf to stop them, right?" she asked him. "Most of our ships were in the South Atlantic and got here as quick as they could. But we don't know what or where they got through before we formed the blockade," Schaefer said. "What about the Chinese troop buildup in the Bahamas? I know officially that was denied, but we have intel that says otherwise. What about those 200,000 illegal workers they brought into the Caribbean?" Analyst Brown asked. He looked up from the laptop, adjusted his eyeglasses on his face, and shifted toward Smith. "They're not going anywhere. We've had submarines there since the beginning. If they move a muscle, it'll all be over for them. The initial assault will most likely come from the PLA's Army Amphibious Assault Brigades. China's Marine Corps may play a role at some point, but the main amphibious force will be their army. They're equipped with amphibious tanks and troop carriers. That's where we'll get them," Schaefer said. Stevens's head was spinning. They sounded confident that the invasion would be put down quickly, but she'd been on the ground in Houston. She'd seen what fighting with limited technology looked like. "How are we going to be effective without all our modern technology?" she asked. Schaefer turned to her and smiled. "Most of our technology works fine. We've had hiccups with our comms because of cyber hacks of our satellites, but we're quickly working around that issue. Don't worry, sweetheart, we've got this. You'll see." Stevens cringed and gritted her teeth. She was accustomed to the misogynistic terms and usually called them out on it, but she let it go this time. She needed to stay in the loop, not be frozen out. "Just wait until you see all our new toys," Schaefer said. "Can they stop tanks and helicopters?" she asked. "Sure can. We've got anti-tank missiles that'll stop them in their tracks." "And you're able to move sufficient troops that way to prevent them from successfully invading?" "They're on their way. Everything's being planned from a room just on the other side of that wall," Schaefer pointed. "What's the plan for all the citizens down there caught in the middle of a war zone?" Schaefer gave her a blank stare. "Houston alone is a city of over 2 million people. Is there no plan to evacuate them?" Schaefer shrugged. "That's above my pay grade. I heard that FEMA was setting up a shelter in Texarkana. A cable went out to Shreveport to send troops there to help receive refugees. I heard nothing about a plan to help them get there or anything. That is supposed to be our rear operating base. Major General Waltrip will be moving his headquarters there in the coming days," Smith said. "Retreating?" Stevens didn't receive an answer. The door opened and Waltrip appeared. Everyone stood. The officers in the room saluted. "Clear the room. I need to speak with the analysts," he said. When the officers had exited, Waltrip took a seat at the head of the conference table. "Now tell me how General Walter Dempsey got involved with this plot." 1. Will. Day 7. Will Fontenot watched from the window overlooking the parking lot as two figures moved between the buildings across the way. They remained hidden among the shadows, so he was unable to recognize them. He doubted that it would be Gus or any of Kevin's bandmates. His brutal murder still had residents there unnerved, even though the killer had been brought to justice. Isabella and Caden were sleeping. The sun would be coming up soon, and the three of them would be leaving to begin their journey to his sister's homestead in Louisiana. He should have been relieved. It was all he'd wanted since the lights went out, but he wasn't. Now, fear of the unknown had set in. He had no idea what to expect out there on the road. People were his greatest fear. He'd seen what they were capable of now that law enforcement wasn't there to protect the citizens. A scream sounded from across the way. It was a female voice. Will had thought the only females still in the apartment complex were located in Isabella's building. Will raised his rifle and moved to get a better look, but all he saw was darkness. He waited and listened. A moment later, the shadowy figures of two men ran from a ground-floor apartment and headed toward the street. Will debated with himself. Should he go see if the woman was all right? He glanced toward the bedrooms. He couldn't leave Isabella and Caden sleeping and defenseless. Going out there alone wasn't smart either. The incident only went to show him how difficult it was going to be out there. They would have to have one person awake and guarding their location at all times. He and Isabella would need to sleep in shifts, which would mean none of them would be getting enough rest. There were moments when he considered whether staying put was a better plan. At least they had a defendable position. That's fear talking, he reminded himself. It wasn't sustainable. Eventually they'd need to leave to find food. They'd already been competing with all the other hungry and desperate people for the scant resources still available in the city. For that reason alone, going was their only option. "I thought I heard someone scream," Isabella said. She pulled a thin purple robe over her slim frame and joined Will by the window. "From there," Will pointed. "I saw two people running from that downstairs apartment." "That's supposed to be vacant. You checked it when—" She stopped herself. He and Gus had checked that apartment and all the others in that building when they'd searched for Kevin's killer. But that didn't mean that someone hadn't taken up residence there since then. There would be thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of displaced residents seeking shelter around Houston. The security gate that once separated and somewhat protected the apartment complex from outsiders no longer worked. Anyone could just walk up and move on in. It was empty. That whole building was unoccupied. People could have moved in while we were gone, though. She stretched her arms above her head and yawned. Will could barely make out her face in the moonlight coming through the open window. "What time is it?" she asked. "No idea. Has to be close to sunrise. See the hint of light on the horizon?" She leaned close to the window. He could smell the fragrance of her shampoo and recalled their kiss the day before. He'd just pulled her from the rubble of the flight museum. They'd been in a fierce battle with Chinese insurgents, and Isabella had just learned that Agent Bentley had been killed in the fight. She'd been distraught. He was trying his best to comfort her. She may not even remember the kiss. She may not remember, but he couldn't forget it. He had qualms of conscience about it now. It was too soon, for both of them. He was still grieving the death of his wife, and Isabella had just lost her boyfriend. The timing was awful. It would never work between them. Guilt resurfaced. He was sick of the feeling. "I think I'm going to get dressed and then make some coffee." She touched his shoulder. His heart rate sped up. "We're still heading out at first light?" she asked. "Yeah, if you think you're up to it. I don't think we should wait. I'm hoping we can come across some form of transportation. I think bicycles are still our best bet until we can find something better. Even though you can't pedal, I could push you, and we could put our supplies on another for Caden to push." "I don't want you to have to push me on a bike. I'll be okay. I can walk." "We could put supplies on both bikes and carry twice the stuff," Isabella suggested. After seeing the gash in her leg the day before, he knew she was lying, but they could start out, and she'd soon realize she was slowing them down by not getting on the bike. He'd make sure to load them in a way that she could still ride when she chose to. By the time Isabella and Caden were up and ready, Will had all their supplies loaded into backpacks or trash bags and sitting by the door. Lieutenant Sharp had instructed the soldiers to return the gear they'd taken from him, but all he'd received was his empty rifle. He'd carry it in hopes that he might come across ammunition for it somewhere. Going out there without a weapon was crazy, but he didn't have any other option. Isabella's hair was pulled back and stuffed inside a ball cap. She wore an oversized t-shirt, baggy jeans, and Timberland-style boots. Will did a double-take. She looked like a dude. "Is that a 5 o'clock shadow on your cheeks?" Will leaned in to get a closer look. Her previously feminine eyebrows now appeared bushy and unkempt. "It's amazing what you can do with an eyebrow pencil." "Why?" "Women were targets for all sorts of perverts before all this lawlessness. I don't want to stand out as weak. From a distance, someone will think we're just 3 dudes. It might deter trouble. At least that's the hope." The corners of Will's mouth tilted up in a weak smile. "It could work, I guess." He doubted it would fool anyone up close, though he hoped to avoid people in general as much as possible. "I think you look good as a guy," Caden said. Isabella laughed. "Thanks, I think." Caden pointed at her legs. "You still walk like a girl." "Oh yeah, should I walk like this?" Isabella stood with her legs squared with her shoulders and moved like a bow-legged cowboy from a spaghetti western. Caden chuckled. "No, definitely do not walk like that." "I'm with Caden. You walk like that and you'll attract attention for sure," Will said, throwing a backpack over his shoulder. He pulled open the door and came face to face with Gus. "Well, hello," Gus said. "We came to see if you guys were heading out anytime soon." Jazz stood beside him. She was not disguised as a man. In fact, there'd be no mistaking her for a dude in her tight shorts and tank top. A small baby bump was barely visible. If he hadn't known she was pregnant, he might not have even noticed. At least she was wearing running shoes. No doubt, within 5 minutes outside, she'd regret not covering up every inch of her skin. The mosquitoes after a hurricane were relentless. "We're heading out now. I was going to see if I could locate that bike you told me about, and we'll see if we can find a couple more on our way," Will said. Jazz's face lit up. "How about a ride in a car?" "You found a running car?" Isabella asked. "We did. Well, a crew cab pickup truck. It's old and beat up, but it will fit all our stuff and still have room for the 3 of you." Isabella turned to Will. Her eyes were brighter than he'd ever seen them. "Did you hear that? I don't have to walk around like a dude and worry about getting attacked by perverts." "Where did you say you were going?" Will said. He didn't want to burst her bubble, but if they weren't heading in the same direction, it wouldn't work. "My mom lives in Liberty," Jazz said. "See, Will, that's sort of on the way to Louisiana," Isabella said. It was 40 miles north of Interstate 10. They'd have to take US 90 into Louisiana. It wasn't a deal-breaker since they'd be traveling by vehicle, at least to Liberty, but he wasn't sure. "We thought the Crosby Freeway would be their best road to take. It likely had less traffic on it when the event happened," Gus said. The more Will thought about it, the more he agreed. He just wasn't as familiar with that route. He'd selected places along I-10 that they could stop and rest and maybe find supplies. He'd be blindly taking another way. "You can have the truck after we reach my mom's," Jazz said. Gus's head whipped around, a look of surprise filling his face. She smiled and his features softened. "Yeah, you can take the truck. It'll be safer," he said, casting a glance at Caden. A smile crossed Will's face. Things were looking up. In a few hours, they'd be rolling into Vincent, Louisiana. He hoped Savannah had something hot and spicy cooking. He was dying for gumbo and boudin. 2. Isabella. Day 7. Isabella found it challenging to do anything with her left hand in a splint and her right forearm sore from second-degree burns. Getting dressed had taken far longer than normal, and applying the makeup to disguise herself was painful. She hadn't been at all looking forward to walking all the way to Louisiana, so when Jazz and Gus showed up offering them a ride, she'd been beyond thrilled. Isabella made one last sweep of her apartment while Will and Caden carried their supplies down to the truck. She stared at the framed photos of her family lined up on top of her chest of drawers, running a finger across a black and white photo of her mother when she was Isabella's age. She'd been beautiful and lively. Tears welled in Isabella's eyes and spilled down her cheeks. Would she ever see her parents again? Were they safe? Her mother kept a small garden and a few hens. They should have food for a little while. But knowing her mother, she'd share with the neighbors, so it wouldn't last that long. If her sister were smart, she'd take her family to their parents' place. Oklahoma City was no Houston, but by now, people there would be desperate enough to be dangerous. The small town of Chickasha, Oklahoma, where Isabella was raised, was filled with friendly and generous people. They always knew their neighbors and often ate with them following church on Sundays. It had been such a shock to her when she'd moved to Houston and people were so standoffish. It had taken her a while to adjust and not have her feelings hurt when people didn't respond to her friendly greetings. Soon she learned that people who lived in cities the size of Houston just weren't as trusting of strangers as she was. She picked up her nephew's baby picture. He was 5 years old now, old enough to understand that things were different. Her heart hurt thinking of him living through this nightmare. What type of childhood would he have if the lights didn't come back on soon? What about Caden? He had turned 13 on the day of the EMP. How different would life be for him than when she was a teen? There'd be no Friday night football games, no homecoming dances, no graduation. Will had said that his sister homeschooled her children, so at least Caden could continue his education. She was sure that Will would do everything he could to give him as normal a life as possible. She just wasn't sure what their new normal would look like. "Isabella, we're ready," Caden called from the living room. In a few hours they would be in Louisiana, and she'd be meeting Will's family. She almost felt guilty that she had somewhere like that to go, not knowing if her own family was going hungry. How long could someone go without food? She couldn't stop thinking about them. Maybe after we get to Savannah's, I can take the truck and go get them. Would it be too rude to ask her to take on several more people? "Okay, I'm coming," Isabella called back. She scooped up her family photos and shoved them into the backpack with all the socks and panties from her drawers. Since they wouldn't be walking now, she could bring more than 2 pairs. Isabella glanced in the mirror as she turned to exit her bedroom, surprised by how effective her disguise was and how much she looked like a guy. She patted her chest and considered loosening the ace bandages binding her breasts. She raised her shirt, found the end of the bandage, then stopped. Will's Jeep had been carjacked, leaving them on foot. If that happened again, she'd still need the disguise. Out of habit, she flicked the light switch off before closing the bedroom door. "Otis, here, kitty kitty," she called. Isabella stopped at the door to the guest room and waited for the black and white cat to emerge. "Otis, come on, buddy." There was no sign of him. He always came when she called him. "Caden, is Otis in his spot in the kitchen?" she asked as she walked down the short hall leading to the living room. "I haven't seen him today." Isabella stopped still. She hadn't either. Her head pivoted toward the open window where a hole had appeared in the screen. Isabella ran over and touched the spot. "Otis must have clawed his way out sometime in the night." "Oh no," Caden said. "I'll help you look for him." "He might be in the woods behind the apartments. He goes there when he escapes. If he's up a tree again, I'm going to—" Isabella and Caden raced past Will and Gus as they were loading the truck to search under cars and around piles of debris. After searching the grounds around Isabella's apartment and the woods behind the complex, Caden finally found Otis stalking birds near the playground. "You scared me to death, you bad boy," Isabella scolded the cat. Once Otis was tucked inside his carrier, Isabella joined Caden near the truck. "Let's get the heck out of here," she said, placing a hand on his shoulder. "I'm so glad we're not walking or taking bikes," Caden said. "You and me both, buddy. We could actually be there by lunch. I bet Aunt Savannah has bread baking right now. I can almost smell it." "Stop, you're making my stomach growl," Isabella said. Will and Gus spread a tarp over the bed of the truck, concealing all their belongings. It looked like Jazz had packed their whole apartment. Isabella wondered if the sight would make them a bigger target, like a running vehicle wasn't enough to attract attention. Isabella awkwardly grabbed a handhold with her right hand to pull herself up into the back passenger seat of the old pickup. Caden placed the cat carrier on the floorboard at her feet. There wasn't much room to stretch her injured leg. She'd just have to grin and bear it until they reached their destination. "What's with the disguise?" Jazz asked as she climbed into the front passenger seat. "I'm hoping to not become a victim out there." "Well, that will probably do it. Sorry to say, but you make a cute dude." Isabella chuckled. "Thanks." Caden walked around and climbed into the middle seat next to Isabella. He placed his book in his lap and looked for a seatbelt. "How old is this thing? Does it even have seatbelts?" "Old, I think. Maybe from the 70s. My mom said they didn't have seatbelts when she was a kid. It's a wonder they survived the way my grandpa drove," Jazz said. "My great-grandpa's Jeep had seatbelts, and that was from the 70s. Isabella twisted and dug inside the crack between the seats, finally finding the strap for the middle belt. "Here," she said. "Buckle up for safety." "My mom used to say that," Caden said, his voice low. "I bet you miss her," Jazz said. "How'd she die?" Isabella winced. That wasn't something she thought people should ask a kid. The boy had lost his mother. It was likely too painful to talk about. "Car accident," Caden said, picking up his book and turning to a dog-eared page. "Sorry, that sucks," Jazz said. Something loud banged in the back of the truck. Isabella jumped and spun in her seat to see Gus dropping a long, thick chain into the bed. Her heart was still racing when he climbed in the pickup's cab. "What is that for?" "In case we need it. It came with the truck," Gus said. "Is everyone ready?" "Freaking more than ready," Jazz said. "Absolutely," Will said, climbing into the seat next to Caden. His smile warmed her heart. She couldn't recall ever seeing his teeth. He had a nice face. A flush grew behind her cheeks as she recalled their kiss, and she turned away. "Let's get the heck out of here," Jazz said, as Gus put the truck into gear and pulled from the parking space in front of their building. Kevin's bandmates stood at the second-floor landing. Isabella raised her hand and waved. They waved back, but none of them were smiling. She regretted leaving them there like that. They might have been able to make room for them in the pickup's bed, but it wasn't her truck. And where would they take them anyway? She couldn't be responsible for every person she knew. Hell, she couldn't even take care of herself at the moment. They'd have to find their own way home, or stay and fight it out with the rest of the desperate residents of Houston. As the truck turned out of the parking lot onto the main road, a pit formed in Isabella's stomach. Dread crept up on her. The dread of the devastation they would see, and the unknown dangers they faced. A couple of hours' drive pre-apocalypse would have been no big deal. But now, that same trip could be filled with danger around every turn. 3. Will. Day 7. There were some tense moments as the truck rolled through Isabella's neighborhood, heading toward the freeway. Some residents were camping in tents on their front lawns due to their homes' conditions following the hurricane. Now that the floodwater had receded, large groups had made camp in the parking lot of the grocery store where Will and Gus had been the day before. Will wondered how long they would wait around for help to arrive before leaving to find better resources. He doubted much was left inside the store, and with that many people to feed, it wouldn't be long before they ran out completely. The on-ramp for the Gulf Freeway was filled with abandoned vehicles. Beyond them, the interchange had been blown up. They wouldn't be taking that route. After backtracking a few blocks, they headed east to hop onto Interstate 610. When Gus suddenly stomped on the brakes, Will's head whipped around to see why. "Military vehicles up ahead," Gus said. "Are they ours?" Isabella asked. Gus glanced back over his shoulder at her. "Who else's would they be?" I don't know." Will leaned forward to get a look for himself just as they entered the cross street. They were American. He felt the tension ease and sat back as they disappeared from view. A moment later, a loud explosion rumbled through the area, and black smoke rose above a row of businesses ahead. Gus floored it and sped through the intersection. Isabella's eyes were wide. Her hand covered her mouth. Caden was stiff in his seat.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?